When people think about the U.S. Civil War, they think of rolling green hills, marshy rivers, and idyllic farmland. Important battles such as Gettysburg, Antietam, and Bull Run took place in green and rural areas, while other battles such as Vicksburg and Fort Sumter took place beside important bodies of water. Most of the time, battles were fought around obstacles such as rivers and streams, along with marshes, forests, and thickets. The U.S. Civil War is portrayed as verdant and wet, and for the most part it was, but that is not the whole story. The vast majority of the Civil War's important battles were located in the Eastern Theater. Precious few took place in what was known as the Trans-Mississippi Theater, that is, anything west of the Mississippi River. Even then, the Trans-Mississippi is often remembered for things like Bleeding Kansas and the bushwhackers of Arkansas and Missouri. But there was another theater that is barely remembered, that took place not in wet and verdant fields, but in dry canyons, lonely mesas, and parched deserts. There was an entire campaign that took place in the American Southwest, and while most of the Civil War was focused on states like Virginia, Maryland, and Tennessee, other states like Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico also factored in prominently. For a few tense months in 1862, it looked like the futures of the Union and the Confederacy could revolve around the fate of New Mexico. If that statement has you scratching your head, you are not alone. The New Mexico campaign, and indeed the Southwestern Theater as a whole, have largely been forgotten. It was not as large or as flashy as the campaigns in the East, and the characters involved have been shunted to a seemingly inert sector of the war for a reason. But despite that, a short period of intense attention was given to this remote corner of the map. One Confederate general had hatched a plan that he believed had the potential to change the entire face of the war. If this plan had come to fruition, the Confederate States of America would have swelled in size, gained access to lucrative gold mines, and seized deep, warm water ports on the Pacific coast. The stakes were high, and the Confederacy had everything to gain and little to lose. Hello, and welcome to Forgotten and Found, a history podcast. This is the story about the Civil War that is rarely told. Many people don't even realize that there was a campaign in New Mexico during the Civil War at all, and fewer still realize the ambition and the scope behind it. There were multiple battles fought during the New Mexico campaign, and one of them was so decisive that some overzealous historians have dubbed it the Gettysburg of the West. Many of the places fought over during this phase of the war became staples of what would become the Wild West. The West would become so wild in the 1870s and 1880s in part because of the large number of Confederate war veterans who tacked up their horses, hitched their wagons, and headed westward with their guns and martial experience in tow. The 6 shooters that became the face of the Wild West were carried out there by Civil War veterans. Many of the guns that were used in the rampant bouts of crime that would plague the region were originally Army issued. Some of the men who later found themselves working cattle, gambling in saloons, and drinking rot-gut whiskey from personal stills likely made their way out there because they had been there before. Before the West was wild, the West was at war. And this is the story of that war, the Civil War's forgotten wild Western theater. The Wild West entered the Civil War because of a dream born in the mind of Confederate General Henry Hopkins Sibley. Henry Hopkins Sibley was born in 1816 in Natchitoches, Louisiana. Sibley came from a family with roots that went all the way back to the American Revolution, one of those original families whose names appeared over and over during the earliest days of the United States. Sibley's grandfather served in the Revolutionary War as a medic, and his father was tasked with helping to settle Louisiana after the Louisiana Purchase was completed. Henry's cousin, Henry Hastings Sibley, became the first governor of Minnesota. That branch of the family migrated northwest, while the southern branch was dispatched to the bayous of the Gulf Coast. Sibley was born in Louisiana before moving to Missouri at the age of 7 after the death of his father. Continuing in the tradition of his family, with service to the United States, Sibley was accepted into the United States Military Academy at West Point. Graduating in 1838, he embarked on a career as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army, serving on the rugged frontiers of a young and expanding nation. Sibley proved himself early on, participating in campaigns during the Seminole Wars and later in the Mexican-American War, where he honed his leadership skills in the heat of battle. But Sibley wasn't just a soldier, he was an innovator. He designed the now famous Sibley tent, a conical shelter that became a staple of military camps in the mid-19th century. Its practicality and ease of use showcased Sibley's ability to combine ingenuity with the harsh realities of military life. The Sibley tent became a familiar sight in the frontier and in army camps throughout the nation. After over 20 years of military service, Sibley faced a stark choice. It was the same choice that many career officers faced in 1861. Fight for the Union and try to hold the country together, or fight for the South and forge a new path for a new nation. Sibley chose the latter, as most Southrons did. In 1861, Sibley had resigned from his position in the U.S. Army and took a commission with the Confederacy. He was assigned a small volunteer cavalry regiment based in western Texas at Fort Bliss. Sibley immediately renamed his cavalry regiment to the Army of New Mexico, a grand title that matched his grand vision for the South. Sitting in a dusty barracks at Fort Bliss, Sibley took one look at a map and believed that he had found the solution to the Confederacy's list of growing problems. The South was facing two early and pressing issues. First, the Union blockade, designed to crush the life out of the South's fragile economy, was taking shape and was seen as an immediately concerning problem. Second, the South was struggling with funding. The South only had two types of currency to barter with: raw cotton and Confederate bills. Almost everyone, from the British to the Native Americans, believed Confederate paper currency to be worthless, leaving them to deal in cotton alone, which had to be shipped via the sea, which was now being patrolled by vigilant northern ships. If the South wanted to expand and ultimately survive, it was going to have to figure out a way to circumnavigate these issues. Sibley took a finger and placed it on Fort Bliss in El Paso and dragged it westward into a sparsely populated portion of the map, New Mexico. Here was the South's future. To Sibley, the Confederate States of America could survive and thrive if they expanded westward from Texas into the hot and barren Southwestern United States. The Union did have a presence here, a skeleton crew manning a series of outdated forts designed to keep an eye on tribes such as the Apache and the Zuni. If Sibley could seize New Mexico, including the cities of Albuquerque and Santa Fe, he could use them as a base of operations to strike northward into southern Colorado and westward towards California. Southern Colorado had a series of productive mines, producing things like gold, silver, and iron. These mines would help provide the South with a steady stream of income, and backing their new paper currency with raw gold would immediately make it more valuable and legitimate. Colorado also had the benefit of being far from the Union blockade and could easily ship gold and silver throughout the Confederacy without having to cross Union gunboats. Opening a land corridor to California would also connect the territories such as Mississippi and Florida to the Pacific Ocean. Securing ports along the California coast would immediately break the Union blockade. It would force the Northern Navy to deploy ships to California, which would have reduced the overall effectiveness of the blockade. There is no way that the North could effectively patrol the Atlantic coast, the Gulf Coast, and the Pacific coast simultaneously. There were simply too many miles of coastline. Plans always look good on paper, and this one certainly was ambitious. Sibley's grand invasion plans were dubbed the most expansive and ambitious of the entire war. In the East, Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee had little stomach for invading Northern Territory, but preferred rather to fight a defensive war along the frontier. Sibley's plan would call for the invasion and annexation of New Mexico, Colorado, and California. These territories would have added nearly a third to the Confederate territory and opened up a vast new possibility for their economic and military future. The only thing in the way was a small army and two forts, Fort Craig and Fort Union. On the map, they look like mere tiny dots, and as the visions of glory and vast conquest grew in his head, those dots looked smaller and more insignificant by the day. By 1861, Fort Craig had grown to become the largest fortress in the Southwest. It held over 2,000 soldiers and sat astride the likely route of a Confederate invasion of the territory along the Rio Grande River. The fort was located in south central New Mexico and was a key obstacle in preventing Sibley from making a break for Arizona and California. Due to the dry terrain, cities like Albuquerque were key to sustaining an army in the field. Fort Craig would prevent the South from securing the cities and the supplies they needed to continue their march deeper into Union territory. Lying to the northeast of Fort Craig was Fort Union, north of Santa Fe. Fort Union anchored the northern portion of the long north-south axis, which ran through New Mexico. Fort Craig anchored the southern portion. Santa Fe and Albuquerque lay in between, while Fort Union anchored the northern point. Fort Craig was difficult to supply and difficult to rearm, but Fort Union lay relatively close to the Union territory of Colorado. If Sibley wanted to become the master of New Mexico, he would have to crush both of these forts and push the Union armies back into Colorado. Once the South had secured a number of high-profile victories and the way was open for his army, Sibley had no doubt that his superiors would provide him with ample manpower and supplies to continue the campaign. And that was the plan. Crack 2 Union forts, sweep 1 Union army from the field, and then march north and then west and complete the greatest conquest in Confederate history. All with 2,500 mounted volunteers and without any material support from the rest of the Confederacy, which was more than happy to let Sibley gallivant through the Southwest with little to no oversight. Here is how that all turned out. In 1861, directly following the secession of Texas from the Union, delegates in New Mexico met in a small town of Mesilla to discuss leaving the Union. The delegates wanted to secede from the Arizona Territory, eschew the Union altogether, and join the Confederate States of America. While slavery wasn't a huge consideration for the disparate homesteaders and ranchers of this region, many people felt neglected by the federal government. Many felt as though they were not receiving enough supplies, time, and attention to deal with the marauding Apache warriors and raiders who would come across the border from Mexico. In the spring of 1861, a small number of delegates put together orders of secession. The new independent territory would exist south of the 34th parallel and would have Mesilla as its capital. They named themselves the Territory of Arizona, and immediately began to petition the Confederacy for admission into the new breakaway nation. However, despite the strong words and clear intentions, the new Territory of Arizona had no military, no diplomatic recognition, and no way to change the status quo. The Union had abandoned a series of forts in western Texas and retreated westward into New Mexico, but they had no intention of letting the secessionists in New Mexico off the hook. Safely encamped in Fort Craig, there would be no further retreat for the Union soldiers in the New Mexico territory. In response, a small force of Confederates began to probe along the Rio Grande. The troops started by reclaiming the abandoned forts and outposts in western Texas before slowly moving westward. The initial force consisted of a battalion of the 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles under Lieutenant Colonel John R. Baylor and contained roughly 400 men. They met little resistance, so Baylor decided, with the blessing of his superiors, to continue his march further into Union territory. Baylor marched to the town of Mesilla, the site of the secessionist movement, which was to be the new capital of Confederate Arizona, and there he found Isaac Lind, in command of a contingent of Union forces. Lind demanded Baylor surrender immediately, but Baylor refused. A small skirmish erupted around the town. While both sides were poorly trained and poorly led, the Confederates won out due to their superior ranging. Baylor had managed to haul in a battery of mountain howitzers, which helped to harass and outrange the Union troops. Lind retreated with minor losses, leaving Mesilla in the hands of the Confederate battalion. The battle occurred on July 25, 1861, and it was the first major engagement of the far western theater. Just a week later, the Confederate territory of Arizona was officially established. Confederate Arizona would exist until the end of the war. With the establishment of a new western state centered around Messiah, the Confederacy could now have a foothold from which to work into the rugged Southwest. Sibley's dream of a vast Confederate empire was still alive in February of 1862, but the Union Army was still stubbornly encamped at Fort Craig. The Union forces, under the gruff and cautious Colonel Edward Canby, weren't about to let Sibley's vision succeed without a fight. When Sibley made it clear that he planned on bypassing the fort by skirting around it, Canby had little choice but to try and give battle. Letting Sibley slip away and reach Santa Fe unmolested would have been a black mark on his military record that would have not been easily expunged. But Canby wasn't keen on fighting. He believed himself outmanned, outgunned, and outmatched. But he had led his forces out into the open along the river with the goal of blocking Sibley from advancing any further. Both sides converged on the Valverde Ford, a shallow crossing of the Rio Grande, on February 21, 1862. What followed was a wild, gritty battle that has sadly been forgotten. The Confederates kicked things off with some bold maneuvering, attempting to outflank the Union position, but what they didn't count on was the doggedness of the Union troops, including the hard-fighting New Mexico volunteers, many of whom were local Hispanic militias with a personal stake in defending their homeland. The Confederates had originally believed that they would be eagerly welcomed in New Mexico by the locals, but they found that to be wishful thinking at best. The fighting raged on in the shadow of Fort Craig, with artillery booming across the dusty plains and cavalry charges setting up clouds of grit. The Union forces held firm until late in the day when a Confederate cavalry charge led by the fearless Major Charles Pyron and Colonel Tom Green finally broke through their lines. Green, with his bushy beard and larger-than-life personality, became the day's unlikely hero, rallying his men with sheer bravado. While Sibley would later eagerly take credit for the impending victory, it was Green who took the lead and commanded the field. Sibley was allegedly lying drunk in the back of an ambulance during the critical part of the battle. Accusations like these would dog Sibley for the rest of his military career. The Confederates drove the Union forces back to Fort Craig, claiming the field at Valverde. It was a hard-fought tactical battle, and the Texans reveled in their triumph. Despite winning the battle, they failed to capture Fort Craig or destroy its supplies, which meant their campaign still hung by a thread. When Sibley turned to pursue Canby, he was faced with Fort Craig's formidable fortifications. The Union had wisely adorned the walls with Quaker guns, that is, trees painted like cannons, along with a number of hats made to look like reinforcements. Even without the fake guns adding to the fort's menacing appearance, Sibley did not have the supplies or the heavy cannon needed to reduce the fort. And with stretched supply lines and Union reinforcements looming, their troubles were far from over. The Battle of Valverde wasn't just a fight over a river crossing, it was a clash of ambitions, a test of frontier toughness, and a gritty reminder of how wild the West could be, even during the Civil War. Fighting in the shadow of Fort Craig, each commander fussed and paced about, concerned about the amount of water each soldier had on his person and cursing the lack of heavy guns. This was the Civil War, Western style, where the stakes were high and the action was as raw as the landscape. Lonely forts, little oversight, curious natives, and rugged locals. It is a picture that you will never find from the campaigns in the East, and one that is wholly unique to the campaigns in the West. The victory at Valverde emboldened Sibley and made him believe that the Union were yellow-bellied dogs that were ready to run at the slightest provocation. His Texans had won the field, and now he just needed to figure out how to eliminate the rival army for good. Sibley's new plan was to march northward, to Santa Fe, and to cut the supply and communication lines to Fort Craig. If he couldn't reduce the fort with artillery, he would reduce it by starvation. This move forced Canby to, yet again, abandon the fort and pursue Sibley out into the field. Canby's plan was to pin Sibley in a classic hammer and anvil position. He would sweep northward with his regular troops and pinch Sibley between his army and Fort Union, which was on the outskirts of Santa Fe. In another theater, this plan would not have worked, but Sibley was confined by the terrain and the supply situation. He had to move towards Santa Fe, he had to stay near the main roads, and he could not slip away into the desert without risking disaster. Sibley's dreams seemed to be coming to fruition in the early weeks of March, when he managed to capture both Albuquerque and Santa Fe. However, his position was largely unchanged. He still had Canby's army pursuing him from the south, and both forts, Craig and Union, penning him in. However, always the thinker, Sibley had another plan. Encamped at Santa Fe, Sibley wanted to move northward into Glorieta Pass, a strategic position along the Santa Fe Trail that was key to assaulting Fort Union. Sibley wanted to take Fort Union, which was much less defended than Fort Craig, and then use the supplies to bolster his army before turning back south and facing Canby and forcing him to surrender for good. Sibley sent a picket force northward into the pass to scout and seek out any Union armies that might be lurking there, while the rest of the army lumbered up from the rear. Sibley's pace continued to drop as he ran low on supplies and energy, sapped by the hostile terrain. Historians have called the Battle of Glorieta Pass the Gettysburg of the West. It was the climactic battle of the Civil War's New Mexico campaign, and like many good battles, it started with a heavy dose of mutual surprise. The Southerners were surprised to find a hefty number of Union reinforcements who had marched 400 miles in 2 weeks, nearly 30 miles a day, waiting for them in the field. The Union recruits had mustered in Denver and then hoofed it all the way down to New Mexico just in time for the battle. The Northerners were surprised to find the Southerners in the canyons around Glorieta Pass at all. They had believed that the Confederates had chosen to rest farther south, and they were not prepared to meet them in the narrow, twisting confines of the Rocky Cut. Sibley was right in suspecting that there might be more Yankees hiding in the canyons than he first suspected. The Confederate troops, led by Colonel William Scurry, were a ragtag bunch of Texans, a mix of grizzled veterans from the campaign and fresh-faced cowboys gathered from the surrounding grazing lands. On the Union side, there were Colorado volunteers under Colonel John Slow, miners and mountain men who had traded their pickaxes for rifles. There were 2 groups of hardened frontier fighters, but they were also out of their element, hemmed in by unfamiliar walls and the hills of Glorieta Pass. The main action kicked off on March 28th, with both sides slugging it out in the tight, craggy confines of the pass. It was brutal, close-quarters fighting, more ambush and canyon chase than orderly battle. The Confederates had a slight numerical edge, but the Union troops were scrappy and determined despite their exhausting forced march. Both sides were reduced to blasting at each other's center with whatever they could, while small groups of wily sharpshooters attempted to gain higher ground on the surrounding rocks. There was no room for elaborate maneuvers and only 2 directions to move, forward or back. The battle dragged on for multiple hours, with the din of cannon blasts ricocheting off the canyon walls, and then came the twist, the kind of thing that makes history just oh so much fun. While the main force were duking it out, a Union detachment under Major John Shivington made a bold flanking march. Shivington climbed up to the top of the canyon and simply walked across the high ground before descending into the vulnerable rear. They circled around and attacked the Confederate supply train parked miles behind the chaotic fighting at the front. It was a catastrophic blow for the Confederates. The Union troops eagerly fell on the baggage train, torching the wagons and bayoneting all of the horses, mules, and donkeys arrayed there. Some estimates claim that the Union managed to kill 700 valuable pack animals during the slaughter. Other estimates claim they killed or scared away 500 beasts of burden. In addition to the animals, the Union destroyed 80 wagons, spiked the remaining Confederate cannons, and torched the ammunition. In one stunning blow, the Confederates lost their wagons, their food, their water, and perhaps most painfully, their remaining stores of ammunition, along with all of the animals tasked with hauling these things through the unforgiving desert. The result? The Confederates technically won the battle by driving the Union forces back up the canyon, but upon their return, flushed with victory, they realized that they had likely lost the campaign. A rousing tactical victory had turned into a stomach-wrenching strategic defeat. Without the supplies, they could not hold the territory. The defeat at Glorieta Pass was devastating. Without their supplies, Sibley's small and persistent army was effectively defeated. They could advance no further. Without ammunition, fodder, and extra horses, they could not fight. The only thing to do was to retreat in search of more supplies. Unfortunately, despite his shortcomings, Union Colonel Canby had the foresight to torch as many supplies as he could get his hands on. When Sibley was pinned down in Glorieta Pass, Canby had sent riders and sympathizers to Santa Fe and Albuquerque to steal or destroy whatever excess supplies they could find. When Sibley's exhausted and thirsty army emerged from the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, they found nothing to satisfy them. They found capped wells, plumes of smoke, and a distinct lack of food and weapons. Seeing the situation for what it was, Sibley decided to retreat all the way back to Texas. They had marched out of Confederate Arizona and returned to Fort Bliss. Then, they marched all the way to San Antonio, where Sibley tearfully dismissed the army. With no ammunition, no orders, no supplies, there was no reason to keep his troops mounted in the field. The New Mexico campaign was effectively over. While the territory of Confederate Arizona existed until 1865, it was effectively null following the defeat at Glorieta Pass. The South never again returned to New Mexico, and as the war dragged on, supplies and critical troops had to be positioned in much more critical areas. The Southwest was left to its own devices. The southwestern theater of the Civil War is fascinating for a number of reasons. It featured the most unique topography of the war. It featured grand ambitions and interesting battles. It is nearly forgotten about today. Terms like Confederate Arizona and the Battle of Glorieta Pass barely register, but they are important parts of the history of the Civil War. Sibley and Canby dueled in the desert as the rest of their respective nations ignored them. Sibley was accused of being a drunk and a poor strategist. Canby was accused of being a coward and a poor tactician. Both generals blundered their way through 1862. If it wasn't for the timely intervention of fresh recruits from Denver and a lucky blow against the Confederate supply train, Canby's indecision could have cost him the theater. Instead, Sibley was sent packing back to Texas, where he was reassigned to minor commands in Louisiana before retiring in obscurity. Sibley's vision for the Confederacy in the Southwest was grand, but as with many people in history, his reach far exceeded his grasp. And that is history, once forgotten, now found. If you have listened this far, thank you, and don't go. I have some important news and mild housekeeping to share with you. This episode marks the 6th of the podcast thus far, and I've already learned a lot. When I started this adventure, I committed myself to doing 10 episodes to see how it went. So far, to be honest, the results have been mixed, but I am optimistic about the future. I have also realized that there is plenty of room for improvement. There are going to be some changes coming to the podcast to increase the quality across the board. Season 1 will end on February 17th, and we will continue the current format as I learn to tweak things like my workflow and my cadence. This season was all over the place in terms of tone, theme, and quality. The next season will be much more focused and tightly researched. Season 2 is titled Weird World War II, and that will debut sometime in March. Starting with Season 2, the podcast will move to a bi-weekly release schedule, which will give me more time to improve the quality of the research, writing, and production. Season 3 is going to be about the Bronze Age. Season 4 is going to be about American mythology. That will take me out over a year, and by then we'll know if the podcast is healthy or not. That being said, Forgotten and Found is not going anywhere anytime soon. I'm committed to providing unique stories and insights from history, and I'm committed to improving my craft. Thank you for listening. And if you want to support my work, please check me out at grantpiperwriting.medium.com and consider supporting me on Patreon. That link will be in the description. Thank you again, and until next time, be good and God bless.